Hey guys, sorry I'm late. If you're watching this, you've no doubt already heard about the Lindsay Clancy trial, where the jury is going to have to determine whether or not she's criminally liable for killing her three children. Lindsay allegedly had a postpartum psychosis episode and murdered her three children, which is a very tragic event, obviously, and this is a painful trial for everyone to go through. And I say allegedly because the prosecution is trying to argue that this was calculated, that she did have the ability to conform her conduct, that she had the ability to control herself and know that murder was wrong, you shouldn't do that, that this was premeditated. And so that's what's going on there. Now, as for whether or not I believe she's criminally liable or not, whether she was psychotic or whether she was, in fact, premeditated, I don't really have a clear answer to that question. And I think that's okay. I think a lot of people read about this case or saw that it was coming up and saw it on their favorite channels and social media and automatically formed a very strong opinion. Not everyone, but you know what I mean. Like it's booming all over the internet. People who have decided, without ever hearing a second of the case, people had decided going into it that she was either a totally sympathetic victim of a system that failed her, or she is a vile, evil person who killed her children on purpose and she should go to hell, basically. I've seen some extremely harsh commentary. And to be honest, I'm not really feeling a harsh or certain opinion at this time. I have seen... If you haven't watched me before, if you're new and you're coming across this, I worked as a psych evaluator. I still work, but not at the facility I used to. In the emergency room, so when the Baker Act patients came in, I would get consulted by the emergency room doctors and help them do an initial psych evaluation, talk to the patient, talk to, if they gave me permission, their families, their loved ones, the police, if the police were the ones who brought them in. And I would have to determine with the doctors whether or not they could be safely discharged with a safety plan in place, with somebody to pick them up, somebody to watch over them, that kind of thing, somewhere to go, or if they needed to be involuntarily committed. I also worked on a couple of smaller community psych units around, and in that case, a lot of voluntary patients came in, and so I can tell you with certainty that some patients, when coming in and seeking help for a crisis, voluntarily do get turned away. It's interesting. I've seen that hundreds of times over several years, and I think people just really don't know the depth of all this and how much this goes on. I've seen hundreds of times people get turned away for voluntary inpatient admission. And I had someone in the comment section once tell me, well, I went with my friend and held her hand while I checked her in. I'm like, great. I'm really glad for your friend that you were able to get her help. Great for that. However, there are many people out there who seek help and can't get it. Because there's no middle ground, really. At this point, most of the state hospitals a long time ago closed down. We do have some state hospitals, but there are waiting lists for months and months and months. And those patients who are waiting for the state hospital take up space on our short-term crisis unit for a long time. So we have a limited amount of rooms and amount of beds. We can't overflow the unit because too many patients puts people in danger, especially when you mix psychotic patients with regular, depressive patients who are lucid and know what's going on. There's so much more to all of this than I think a lot of people realize. So I'm not going to sit here and say, I hate this woman, right? I'm not going to do that because I think that there are many ways where she could have and, has said that she was failed along the way. And I think that's possible. Whether or not you think that she is criminally liable, that she's responsible for what she did because she knew what she was doing, whether or not that happened, I can tell you with certainty that the system does fail people because despite our best efforts, we are overworked, underpaid, and we don't have space to help everybody that needs help. It's awful. But that's the way of the world right now. That's why things are so bad. people who are brought in by the police on Baker Act, sometimes people think that if you're brought in involuntarily, that you are required to be there for 72 hours. No, a doctor can take one look at you, talk to you for 15 minutes, and send you home. And it happens. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions about how these systems work. I have seen and talked to not just the people who have been through these things, but their families countless times. I have seen people at their rock bottom, the worst moments of their life. I've been surrounded, it feels like surrounded by people who are in a state of shame or terror because they have hurt themselves, or they wanted to hurt themselves, or they don't even know what reality is and what's going on. And I think I've seen some people talk about psychiatry and medication and the mental health system like it's all a scam at some point. But if you spend enough time around people, really spend time the way that I have and the way that most healthcare professionals who treat mentally ill patients have, you know that it's not. And so I've seen so much that bothers me about the commentary around this case, from the conspiracy theories, which I think are ridiculous, and we'll talk about that shortly, to people saying meds are always bad. Meds will do this to you. Meds will do that to you. Don't take meds. To people saying, well, there's no way that that's what happened to her, because if you do this or that, you can just get help. It's just that simple. It's not. It is sadly not that simple. And I say that not just as somebody who has been there for hundreds of people, maybe even thousands of people, probably thousands of people over all this time, who have been facing those moments, those low moments, but also as somebody who was the patient sitting on a cot in the hallway in the emergency room overnight because there was no room for me. Humiliated at my worst point in my life, being watched by a stranger who was paid to observe me the entire time. So I've been there in just about every way possible. That being said, I know that my experience is not the only explanation for things. I know that sometimes, even if somebody can be really convincing that they are sick, that they tried everything they possibly could, that they're not always telling the truth, that they're not always being truthful. And I have seen some people be very convincing. I remember in my first couple of years, and I'm gonna put this hat on so I don't keep touching my hair. It's growing out, so it's a little bothersome. I had somebody once early on who was extremely convincing that he was hearing voices telling him to shoot up a movie theater. And I just thought, there's no way this guy's lying. There's no way. And then the next day, when he saw the doctor, he said, yeah, I just needed a place to sleep. I didn't mean that. And I can't tell you how many times that has happened. It's a lot. Because for some people, the only way they know how to survive is to be in the system, going in and out, seeking shelter, trying to get food. And so it muddies the waters. And so we can't always trust that people are being 100% honest, especially in a situation where the stakes are as high as Lindsay Clancy's are. Because you can be in a state hospital and they can decline to petition you to continue to keep you there, and you can go home. But if you're in prison, it's not that easy, right? And I say all that to say, I do not feel that I have a certain answer to the question of whether or not she's criminally liable for her actions. Because people can be extremely, extremely convincing, especially in emotional cases like this. They pull at your heartstrings. But people can also be in situations where they tried everything and failed. I will say that I don't think the prosecution's approach to this has been particularly great. for the argument they're trying to make. I think they have it sometimes come across as cold and more like they are trying to punish her than they are trying to, tell what happened and explain what happened to the kids. I don't hate the prosecutors. I don't hate them, right? But I think some of what they've done and the way they've handled the case is, I don't think it's been fantastic. I think the defense attorney is, he's doing his job, right? So sometimes you'll see one of these doctors on the stand. Like, I think it was yesterday I saw he was talking to one of the doctors on the stand, and something about her note that said, not something, comma, pressured speech. And I thought, while I was watching that exchange where he said, that's not what you wrote, and she said, I don't care, I know what I meant. That exchange to me was a little irritating on both counts, because I know that doctors write like that all the time. And I'm not saying she didn't make any other mistakes. I'm just saying for this one situation. I know that doctors write like that all the time. My job requires me now to review medical records all day from 9 to 5. I review medical records and I write notes. That's what I do. And I can tell you that that is extremely common. I also understand where he's coming from and where people criticizing that are coming from, where they're saying, you shouldn't do that because other people might read it and not understand. I think most people who work with that doctor, who understand her style of writing and communicating, probably know what that meant. Most people would. Most people working in that situation would. However, you can't guarantee that somebody else, a different doctor at a different facility, would see that and not and totally get the right message. You know what I mean? So that's what I mean when I say I don't know the answer, because I can absolutely see both sides of that line. And I'm going to go over this civil complaint with you, which outlines some of her case and talks about what happened and details what happened when she killed her kids. And this is her document that she filed in court. You can't just make random willy-nilly accusations and say later admissions and then later say I didn't say that, or that doesn't matter. She killed her kids. These are her words. These are her admissions. She signed off on them, right? Because what I can't get on board with is these conspiracy theories that she didn't do it. And I know there are people that I have respected and come to know that I like a lot who feel differently than me on that. And I've seen that on social media. I've seen it, more than enough now. And I think that I can't agree with that. I cannot agree with that. And we'll talk more about that as we go through the document. But I cannot sit here and say with a good conscience, like, oh, yeah, they should totally look into Patrick right now. No. And I tend to think, even if I am on total polar opposite sides of somebody, that people come from a good place, right? I tend to think that people who are saying stuff like that, they really believe that she didn't do it. I don't see it that way. I think it's nuts. But I respect where it comes from, is a place of trying to protect somebody vulnerable who needs protection. I understand where that comes from, right? A good place. I think it's misguided. And I have no problem saying that. A lot of times I think that people are afraid to speak up or say their opinion because they get attacked by people who are chronically online and vicious. It happens a lot, right? I don't want to be afraid to say what I think. And what I think is that these attempts to paint Patrick Clancy as possibly guilty or saying that Lindsay didn't do it are misguided. I think it's hurtful. I think that in addition to Lindsay and Patrick, who have been going through this for the last few years, their parents, their friends, their loved ones, the people who love them most, have been in a tremendous amount of pain. I think it is cruel to suggest that Lindsay didn't go what she went through, that it was all a lie based on something that you saw on your computer, I think that most people in the public will never know all the details of the investigation. I think there is so much misinformation floating around that people just repeat it. And I think it makes me sick to think that many people will so easily attack someone without ever knowing them. And there are people out there, the people who know them most in the world, who have not testified in this trial, who don't get to sit there and tell you all the good things about them. You are only going to hear answers to the questions that are asked. A small blip in the radar of their relationship. You are not going to get a full picture of how she was as a mother or how he was as a father. You get little statements here and there, like from the nanny, saying she was a dedicated mother, right? But you don't really get the full picture. You don't really know them based on what's been said in this trial. You know what she did. That's about it. You're hearing about a few instances overall, like weeks or days in the span of the entire time they had children together. There's just so much there that people shouldn't be filling in the gaps on or assuming the worst on. And I think when they make intense statements about how absolutely vile and horrible she is or he is, it is extremely unfair. I think that no one person, especially Patrick, who was the sole person working to provide for their family at that time, should ever be expected to manage and handle a mental illness full-time for somebody else when doctors themselves said it wasn't necessary, said it wasn't appropriate for her to be on observation, for her to be inpatient. We are supposed to be able to trust those people. And it's not the family's fault that the doctors didn't take that seriously, that the doctors who turned her away at that one facility didn't sit there and make sure she got safely transferred to another. Because anytime we had a patient come through our emergency services area or emergency room and we couldn't accommodate them, and I thought, this isn't appropriate for our unit, we made sure, our policy was, you make sure they get transportation to somewhere that can handle their condition. You don't just put them out on the street. You don't just say, you know what, go on, you'll be fine in a few days. Go talk to someone else. You don't do that. And so while I don't believe all of her doctors failed her, I believe she made mistakes based on the testimony that I've heard so far. I believe that she made missteps, didn't do some of the things that she was supposed to do, right? I don't believe all of the doctors failed her. I believe some of them did. And I believe that is an important thing to consider. So, all right, you guys have listened to me rant for about 18 minutes, so why don't I just get into the document here, and we'll talk about this. Okay, give me 1 second here, guys. Okay. Teresa says, I'm not impressed with the prosecutors or most of these medical people in this case. It's a big wake-up call, I hope. It's long overdue for meaningful standards and protocols. So I will say this for the doctors on the stand. The sole job of those attorneys at that time, the defense attorney, is to make them look fucking stupid, right? Like, they need to make them look like they didn't do their job, like they were incompetent in that moment, like they were negligent, right? So how many of us who are private people would perform perfectly or state things perfectly on a stand in a room full of people glaring at you and cameras, knowing that the entire nation, not the entire nation, but you know what I mean, people all over the nation and all over the world are watching and judging you? How many of us would do a perfect job on that stand? Which is why I'm not judging that doctor too harshly for the I don't care what it says thing. I think that was not a good thing to say, right? That was not a great reaction, right? But I'm not judging her too harshly. I think some of these people who come across poorly on the stand, that is a very high pressure situation that I can't say I've ever experienced. So, All right. So this is a civil lawsuit filed by Lindsay Clancy on January 28th of this year. So that was 7 months ago, a little less than 7 months ago. Right? And I want to talk about this because it details what happened that night. It's laying out how she did kill her children. And while the jury in the criminal trial isn't going to hear this, people online who are coming up with various theories saying she never admitted it, she never confessed, she never remembered it, she only said it because Patrick told her or a doctor coerced her, which both of those things are ridiculous, by the way. No evidence of that. But I think that people can't just ignore this. You can say, for the purposes of the criminal trial, this doesn't come into play, right? But you can't, as a part of the bigger picture, ignore completely that she is suing her doctors for negligence, right? And among other things, because she killed her children, which she outlines in this document. And yes, when a lawyer files something like this on your behalf, you have to approve it. Okay, this is not something that they wrote, didn't show her, and then just put on the court docket. This is an official court document, right? It's a lawsuit. So we're going to go through it together. Okay. This is an action for personal injury and loss of consortium brought by Lindsay M. Clancy. This action arises from the catastrophic failure of multiple medical providers to properly diagnose, treat, and monitor Lindsay's severe postpartum psychiatric condition. Despite her repeated, desperate pleas for help and her family's persistent efforts to obtain adequate care, Lindsay Clancy did everything a mother in her situation could do. She recognized something was wrong with her. She sought medical treatment. She went to emergency rooms. She called crisis hotlines. She admitted herself to hospitals. She took the medications prescribed to her. She communicated her worsening symptoms to her providers. She told them the medications were making her worse. Her husband advocated for her. Notice they said her husband advocated for her. Like, these people online are demonizing the shit out of her husband, her ex-husband. And she's not even doing that. Her attorney's not doing that. No one is doing that. And I just want to point out here, their families, his family, her family, all of their friends, everyone involved, every investigator who touched this case, every doctor in the ER who assess these questions that people have about her body temperature and her injuries, all of them are not in a special secret plot together. If they believed, had a reasonable reason, they who have way more insight into these people's lives and their investigation than we do, if none of them questioned that she did it, including her parents, her family, none of them are blaming Patrick or pointing the finger at Patrick, why the hell would I feel like I should, without a doubt, point the finger at him and say he did it? Why should I pick apart what he's eating in his car? Why should I pick apart, if he went out for brunch one time or 2 times or however many times? I don't care if it was once a week. I don't care if it was twice a week. Why should I care about that? Because everybody involved, everybody who knows what actually happened, who was there, knows that Lindsay did it, admits that Lindsay did it. This is not a question. And I think it's cruel, not just to Lindsay, who deserves to have this situation with her mental health and how it was handled, given proper attention and thought and care so that this doesn't happen to anyone ever again. But also, it's not fair to her parents, to his parents, to his new wife, who people are randomly saying was in on it, to his best friend, who people are randomly saying was secretly the one at CVS because they look alike. People merged the best friend's face onto him using AI and tried to pass it off. It's sick. It's fucked up. It's wrong. That's my opinion. I know that there are some people that I really like, some people that I really care about who are not going to agree with that. But that's what I think. And I'm not going to sit here and lie or be afraid to say what I think, just because some people might not like it, right? So we're all just going to have to agree to have our own opinions on that. So, her family drove from out of state to help care for her children, and still the medical system failed her completely. Okay. The defendants, and then they list all her doctors and the the company here, right, and the a woman and infants hospital of Rhode Island there, each failed to properly diagnose Lindsay's bipolar disorder with postpartum onset, and instead subjected her to a disorganized, uncoordinated course of polypharmacy that exacerbated her condition and precipitated a severe psychotic break. Now, I want to point out here, this is her side of the story here. She and her lawyer are explaining what happened to her, how they see it, the argument they're trying to make. Now, what some of these providers might come back and say is, she didn't take the medication the way I directed, or she didn't tell me this, she didn't tell me that. And so there are going to be explanations in response to this, and you have to kind of decide who you think is credible and who you think is at fault based on what you read. Because I'm not reading their side of the story or any response that they've filed, if they have at this point, I can't tell you exactly what that's going to be. I know what's been testified to in the criminal trial, but these are two separate matters. So they, of course, are saying the polypharmacy was the issue. The providers might dispute that, but we'll see how it goes. Jennifer Cottrell 71. Hey, it says, hey, Lauren, I was afraid to watch this because of all the cruel comments I've seen out there, but I can tell you're going to do this with the appropriate compassion. But I'm spent for today. I'll read. Oh, no problem, man. No problem. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I understand. I've seen, like, the reason I didn't want to cover this live, that I'm not covering the trial live, I'm not even going to really talk too much about the actual criminal trial until after closing statements, is it is awful, and it is an awful and terrible subject. Like, it's a terrifying thing, something that's necessary to address, no doubt, but it's terrible. And I would be so uncomfortable sitting in front of the camera and watching that in real time. I just can't do it. So I understand if you like can't watch, if you're like tapped out for the day, I'm not gonna be like, no, sit here and watch, or else. You know what I mean? Like, go get some sleep, go hang out with your family, whatever, man. I understand. Right? Let's see. Beagle Mama 90 says, I'm so upset with Mandy Mangan. I started following her for the Blake stuff, and she thinks Patrick did it and is doing videos spreading that around. So I just want to say here, like, this is what I'm talking about. Like, Mandy and Elsie and some other people who I've heard talk about this, they're people that I like, right? And we share the same opinions on other matters. And I think if you have a wildly different opinion than somebody, it doesn't mean that you don't share the core values, because I believe that a lot of people, not everybody, mind you, there are some people who are just terrible. And sometimes they get frustrated and I'm just like, you're stupid. But that's just an emotional reaction. I believe that they are coming from a place of thinking, this woman needs protection, somebody wronged her, and they need to make it right. And that, if it were the case, I believe that would be a noble cause, right? I totally disagree on this matter. I totally disagree that Patrick had anything to do with killing the children. I think it's extremely harmful. However, I don't think that they are doing this to harm. I don't think they're doing this with the intention of being harmful. And so I try to take a step back and say, where is this person coming from? Where is this coming from, right? Because I'm a really reactive person, actually. I'm very emotionally reactive. And a lot of people don't always see that, but it's true. And so I have to stop and think about stuff like that. And when it comes to strangers, like random people on the internet who say crazy ass shit, you might see me kind of fly off the handle a little bit. But when it comes to people that I know and who I know are at their core good people, I'm just kind of like, if I disagree with them, I need to understand where that's coming from. And that is, one of the most important things to me is like, who are you at your core and why are you doing this? And I will sit here and tell you guys what I think. And I think a lot of us have friends and family members who have opposite opinions from us on this matter and other serious matters in viral cases, right? And I will think, I know this person, I know where they're coming from, and I've never known them to be somebody who doesn't care about people, somebody who doesn't want to hurt people. I believe that this rhetoric is harmful, but I don't think that's the intention. And so I will treat it as such. I'm not going to go attack these people, right? So I know that's that's frustrating in itself to some people, right? They're like, no, Lauren, you should do that. I'm like, no, I'm going to handle it my own way, no matter how frustrating that may be. So, all right. So let's keep moving here. I will read these really quickly before we move on, and then we'll go there. Yoli King, thank you for the 10 jewels. Appreciate that. Oh, and thank you for the 2 jewels. Awesome. Greedy Gambler Slots, thank you for the 30 jewels. Awesome. Redondo Beach, thank you for the 2 jewels. Oh, and again, the 2 jewels. Oh, wow. Again, 20 jewels. Thank you so much. That's awesome. 3 times. Wow. Matcha Latte, thank you for the 10 jewels. And South Florida Thrifter, thank you for the 2 jewels. Appreciate you guys. Let me just keep moving here. All right. The psychotropic medications Lindsay received appear to have paradoxically exacerbated her underlying psychiatric vulnerability, precipitating a state of manic psychosis characterized by compelling command hallucinations. The tragedy that followed was the direct and proximate result of the defendant's collective negligence in failing to recognize obvious warning signs, coordinate care, properly diagnose Lindsay's condition, and provide treatment that met the applicable standard of care. Now, that's something I've heard people argue about as well, is these providers gave the standard care, right? They met the standard of care. And then some people say they didn't, right? And that's, a lot of people aren't going to want to hear this, but the standard of care does not always meet everyone's needs. It doesn't mean they didn't do what they're trained to do or what they are allotted time to do with their workloads. I'm telling you, like, the standard of care, it's not much. It's not much. People hear psychiatrists sometimes and think it's somebody you talk to about all your problems who then prescribes you medication. It's not. It's somebody you see for 15 minutes a month or sometimes every 3 months who prescribes you medications to assist with your problems that you're supposed to work out with a therapist, because a psychiatrist and a counselor or a therapist or even a psychologist are very different things. The standard of care for a psychiatrist, it's get in and get out. Obviously, that's not everything, right? But that's kind of the way that I would characterize it. It's get in, get what you need, and get out. They're not going to sit there and listen to your life story unless they work for like a private practice where they have control over how many patients they see and how much time they spend with you, which is amazing, right? But a lot of it is get in, get out. So, and you kind of have to follow up with a therapist for your problems, working through your problems like that. So, all right. Is this big enough for you guys to read? Let me zoom in a little bit more. That should be better. If it's not, just let me know. 1 second. Fiji009 says, you're very balanced. Love how you're nuancing this. Your fellows content creators is a good example. Bravo. Thank you. I appreciate that. Cool. All right. Okay. As a direct result of defendant's negligence, Lindsay suffered catastrophic physical injuries, including permanent paralysis, and she lost her 3 beloved children, Cora Marie Clancy, Dawson William Clancy, and Callan Patrick Clancy. Lindsay now faces a lifetime of physical disability, psychological trauma, and the unbearable grief of waking up every day knowing she killed her children, all of which could have been prevented had defendants provided competent medical care. And people really want to ignore this. But this is what happened. This is her version of events. People keep saying, no, she confessed because Patrick told her. It has been years that she has never disputed what she did, that nobody else in that family disputed what she did. I don't know why people on their computers feel like they know better than everybody involved, everybody who spent time with that family, who knew who they were as parents, who have not come out and said, Patrick did this, Lindsay didn't do this, we don't think she did it. You better believe if one of my friends, if I woke up tomorrow and found out one of my friends murdered their children, who I know they love, and something didn't add up to me as far as did she do it or not, you better believe I would be all over defending them, saying, no, that doesn't make sense. That's not possible. That's not what happened. But I don't see any of that. Not from her, not from Patrick, not from her attorney, not from her attorneys in both cases, right? The people involved with this case who actually know everything that happened to her there, they all agree on this version of events. And people suggesting that she was somehow manipulated into confessing and totally didn't do this. Like, do you know how damaging that is to somebody who's already in a vulnerable mental state? And thank God that she can't see the commentary that's going on online right now. Do you know how damaging it is to somebody in a fragile and vulnerable state to try to convince them to go against their own instincts, to try to convince them that they're wrong and they can't trust themselves, even after all the treatment she's been through in these last few years, even after all that time that's passed and she knows and she recalls what happened? That is something that, and I'm not saying these people don't know Lindsay, right? So I'm not saying that's what this is, but if that came from somebody that knew her, who didn't know what happens around the events of that night, who just met her, who was friendly and like, I don't think you did it. That's kind of gaslighting. It's kind of manipulative and it's scary. If you don't know this woman, you should not be trying to convince her or her attorney that they are wrong. They know everything that's happened in the past few years. I keep seeing people saying, send this to her attorney, send that to her attorney, as if her attorney doesn't know all of that. It's fucking nuts. It's crazy. All right. So they describe the parties here, which of course I'm going to skip over because we all know that, right? Don't need to look at that. Let's see. Okay, we'll go over the facts together. Lindsay was raised in Wallingford, Connecticut. Her formative years were characterized by consistent academic excellence. Okay, we don't need to read all of this. I'll kind of summarize some of the points here. Lindsay's 9-year tenure as a L&D nurse at Mass Gen demonstrated notable professional competence and personal fulfillment. She was passionate about nursing and dedicated to her patients. She married Patrick in 2016. They went to Duxbury, Massachusetts. Lindsay and Patrick had the 3 children. As described by Patrick, before she became ill, Lindsay was dedicated to being a mom, even over-dedicated, worked twice as hard as most, rarely took a break to rest. Lindsay loved our children and never took her frustration out on the kids. She remained as affectionate with the kids as always. Lindsay's mother-in-law, Susan Clancy, testified in grand jury proceedings that she loved everything about Lindsay. She was a fun-loving, doting wife and mother. She loved her kids, and she was a nurturing mother who smiled all the time. And that kind of thing, this is exactly what I'm saying. Like, when people act like she's the most vile, evil thing to ever have been possessed on this earth, and she deserves the worst scum of the earth, like, the people who know her, who love her, that's not what they've described. And so you know something's off there. But there are a lot of people out there who don't believe that, you know, they talk about the entire healthcare industry and like psychiatry as a whole, and they think it's all a sham. And I'm like, I can't believe people actually think that, right? Like, because like most of what you see online when it comes to bad side effects, you know, things about horror stories about hospitals or medications, like you are more likely to see, extremely more likely to see a negative review or a negative experience online than the regular, everyday, normal patient or person who goes through the system and is helped by the system and just goes on to live a normal life. So we get a disproportionate number of extreme complaints online, and people run with that. And there's a reason the internet doesn't decide these kinds of things. It's extremely slanted. But I just think that the internet kind of determining that she is automatically extremely devilish or something like that, like without a reasonable doubt, like that she's the worst person in the world, that she's a terrible, murderous, raving lunatic and always has been, like that's misguided. Because everybody who knows reality, everyone who actually knows the situation, says that's not true. Okay. All right. Lindsay's sister Allison described Lindsay as the kind of person who cares deeply for the people she loves. She shows up for celebrations, writes handwritten notes to show her love and appreciation. She's also there in times of need and finds just the right words to provide comfort and support. Lindsay consistently conveyed profound affection for her children and husband. Okay, she never engaged in any physical harm previously. They say they're talking here about Lindsay's prior postpartum history. It says during Lindsay's first pregnancy with Cora, she experienced anxiety due to an abnormal ultrasound finding that later resolved. She experienced some anxiety during the postpartum period, but returned to part-time work and breastfed for 1 year without incident. Okay. During the postpartum period following her second child, Dawson's birth, Lindsay was initially elated with increased energy. Patrick described that she had manic behavior for multiple days. In October 2020, she had an episode of decluttering to simplify her life, obsessively cleaning and discarding items. She said she felt amazingly on top of things, her thoughts raced, and she constantly felt pressured to be active. After her second pregnancy, anxiety emerged at approximately 2 months postpartum. Although Lindsay was offered Zoloft by a psychiatrist, she declined due to concerns about breastfeeding. Her symptoms resolved through exercise, healthy diet, meditation, and several therapy sessions. Okay. These prior postpartum episodes, including the hypomanic symptoms following Dawson's birth, were critical indicators that should have alerted competent psychiatric providers to the risk of bipolar disorder and the potential for more severe postpartum psychiatric complications following subsequent pregnancies. So I have a couple of issues here, right? First, she declined the medications. Her symptoms resolved through exercise, diet, meditation, and several therapy sessions. Okay, that's great. If you can do it without meds, that's great. I think that's even better. However, I don't want people to think that medication isn't always necessary. It's good to know the effects that these things have and kind of the most extreme effects even and outcomes that can happen. Everybody has to make an individual choice on what they want to put in their body. If you get to a point in your health where you're so bad off where you think I might need some real intervention with medication here, don't automatically assume that every drug is the devil based on what you read online. However, do read stuff online. Do read and do your research and get educated on the side effects and what could happen and bring it up with your doctor before you decide whether or not you want to take a medication. You don't have to assume every medication is going to ruin your life. Don't assume every medication is going to save your life. Okay? You need to decide with your doctor. Even if they try to rush you, insist on asking questions and getting answers before you decide whether or not to put something in your body. It is an individual choice, and not everybody can navigate through this stuff without medication. I'm sorry to say that. I know a lot of people don't like big pharma or whatever, but it changes lives in a very positive way a lot of the time. Otherwise, these things wouldn't be on the market at all. Okay? As far as this should have alerted competent psychiatric providers to the risk of bipolar disorder and the potential for more severe postpartum psychiatric complications following subsequent pregnancies. So bipolar disorder, if you have bipolar disorder, true bipolar disorder, you are not going to get rid of that with exercise. I'm sorry. You can solve a lot of your physical health problems with exercise. God knows. I mean, I should do it more. But your mental health, you're not going to solve everything with exercise. If you have such severe bipolar disorder that you're thinking about killing people, taking a jog isn't going to fix it. So should it have alerted them to the risk? Yes, there is a risk based on her history. Right, there's a risk. But it's not a certainty, especially if they see, oh, she started dieting and exercising and things improved. Then they might think, oh, there was something else going on there. So we don't want to automatically assume that she's bipolar. Because once you start putting people on medications to treat bipolar disorder, if you get the diagnosis wrong, those meds can actually do a lot of damage. A lot. So, and that's part of what may have actually eventually happened here. So, one sec, guys. Okay. These prior postpartum episodes, including the hypomanic symptoms following Dawson's birth, were critical indicators that should have alerted competent psychiatric providers to the risk of bipolar disorder and the potential for more severe postpartum psychiatric complications following subsequent pregnancies. Third pregnancy and initial postpartum period. Okay, she gave birth to her youngest on May 26th, demonstrated significant activation in hypomanic behavior, including an extensive program of exercise beginning only 1 week after delivery. She woke every day before the children at 4 a.m., ran 3 miles, did spinning for 30 minutes on the Peloton, and then 30 minutes of aerobics. On July 4th, only 5 weeks after delivery, she ran a 5-mile race. That's too much. I think most people would agree that is too much. That's not normal. Right after giving birth, 1 week after delivery, that's not normal. That's not normal. And I know that during the criminal trial, one of the providers testified that Patrick said something to the effect of, "My wife is not bipolar." And people can be in denial. He might have been in denial. He might not want to accept that, especially if after the second pregnancy, when there was some sort of concern for that, she was able to, quickly manage it with diet and exercise. That would reinforce the thought that there's no way she's bipolar because we were able to fix it on our own without any intervention, right? However, that was short-sighted. It was it lacked insight into bipolar disorder and the onset of bipolar disorder and what can happen there. I think that wasn't necessarily a great thing to do, to interject and say my wife's not bipolar, right? But I can't judge the guy who's not a psychiatrist. He's not a psychologist. He's not a nurse, not a doctor. I can't judge the guy for being in denial. I can't judge the guy for thinking, no way, because last time we went through this, she just started running and dieting and everything got better. I can't judge the guy for thinking that's not right. Okay. I mean, I think he was objectively incorrect, right? But I can't really blame the guy too much for that. So, especially if you really know somebody and you live with somebody, you love somebody, and somebody's telling you she's bipolar or she has this disease or disorder or that disease or disorder, and you're like, no, they don't. I know them. I would know that's happening, but you didn't know. You didn't see it. Sometimes you're too close. Sometimes you're making other excuses for things in your mind. So, all right. These early postpartum behaviors constituted a hypomanic episode that, combined with her history following Dawson's birth, should have immediately suggested bipolar disorder to any competent psychiatric provider who obtained an adequate history. So, again, I disagree that the prior history definitely pointed to bipolar disorder. I do think it should have been a concern. And I think I need to see the response from the providers before I decide whether or not they took that concern seriously and what else they ruled out. And we're getting one side of the story here, so I want to be a little cautious with that. However, I agree that should have been on their mind. Okay? Lindsay's desperate efforts to seek help. At approximately 12 weeks postpartum, Lindsay's mood switched suddenly to anxiety and depression. She experienced debilitating anxiety, insomnia, sleeping only approximately 3 hours per night, and exhaustion during the day. She had no motivation and could not exercise. Everything about her body felt heavy and required effort. It was a chore to dress or shower. Her parents came from out of state to help care for the children. Now, on paper, those swings like that sounds textbook like bipolar disorder. Recognizing that something was seriously wrong, Lindsay took the initiative to seek psychiatric care. She started seeing Dr. Tufts online and scheduled an appointment. Now, if you're this bad off, go see somebody in person. I understand that online is convenient. It's easier for your life schedule, especially if you have kids, but prioritize your health, right? To where you need to go in person and see somebody. I'm not saying that people doing telehealth can't do their jobs, because they can, but most of the time, the providers that I've seen and a lot of providers that I know require you to have your first visit at least in person. I think that would have been helpful. And I think that if somebody has been, for the record, if somebody has been an inpatient recently, the follow-ups after that should always be in person. You can't force people to do it, but you should always encourage it. Okay. One sec. Okay. At her first appointment with Dr. Tufts, Lindsay's his depression scale score was 23, indicating severe depression. Dr. Tufts prescribed Zoloft, despite Lindsay's hesitation about medication due to breastfeeding concerns, right? And that's a thing that like some people don't think about, especially if you don't have kids, is like you have to think about those kinds of things, right? If you're pregnant or if you're breastfeeding, you have to treat things differently or with more caution than you would otherwise. And that complicates things a lot. When we had patients come in who needed immediate emergent psychiatric care, sometimes if they were pregnant, I would have to go up to the labor and delivery unit and see them there. And we would have a real problem because it's like, I have to find somewhere who can help this woman because I can't send her home. I can't recommend to the doctor that they send her home. That's not right. But her condition is such that the psychiatric unit cannot accommodate her, because if you're pregnant on a unit with psychotic patients, they don't have enough staff to do a one-to-one. There are violent patients. Like it's not safe. So it adds an extra layer of things. I think a lot of people don't realize that with certain conditions. Another one is sleep apnea, right? And not even pregnancy, but like sleep apnea, which men and women suffer from. They have to wear those CPAP at night. If you use a CPAP, you can't be staying on a normal psychiatric unit unless they have one-to-one staff to watch you, or they have special machines hooked up to the wall, which most of our facilities in town don't. Only a couple do. And that's because they can use the tubing which is awful, but does happen. So there are a lot of reasons why pregnancy and certain medical conditions make things more complicated than they already are. And they already are complicated because of the state of our mental health care system. So, and I know I'm rambling a lot. I'm going to try to get through this document. So, okay. She waited 2 weeks before taking the medication, still concerned about its effects, but ultimately began taking the Zoloft. After increasing the Zoloft dose from 25 to 50, she experienced a severe adverse reaction. She didn't sleep for 48 hours, had racing thoughts, worsening anxiety, and felt awful. This dramatic departure from her previous sleep patterns was an obvious warning sign of medication-induced activation consistent with bipolar disorder. So that description, as it's laid out, and like I said, we're only getting one side of the story here. I think that makes sense, right? I think that makes sense that it affected her in that way. Lindsay promptly reported these symptoms to Dr. Tufts. Rather than recognizing the significance, she simply discontinued the Zoloft. So she didn't try to test why she had that reaction. And she prescribed Ativan and Benadryl for sleep. Okay. Oh, okay. So there's a lot of missing information here. I'll say that first. But second, if that's really all that happened, why, if you thought somebody needed an antidepressant, would you just discontinue the antidepressants and then just give them benzos and Benadryl? And also, why both of those things? I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a doctor. I can't prescribe medications to people, but that to me is like, what was the thought process there? I don't understand how they went in this direction rather than thinking, she might be bipolar. But the thing is, I can't see the doctor's response to this right now. I don't know if there is one. If there is, I'll certainly look it up and read it tomorrow. They might have a different explanation for things. So, right. Even after carefully tapering these medications, Lindsay's profound insomnia persisted, accompanied by distressing cardiac palpitations. Her condition continued to deteriorate. On November 16th, her insomnia was so severe she took herself to the ER. She reported insomnia, anxiety, and palpitations. The ER doctors prescribed trazodone for sleep, but it was not effective. Dude, right. At least they didn't pump her full of Ambien that I think somebody did later, right? So this is like the beginning, and it's already, there's a lot going on here that I'm like, hey, let's slow down a little bit. Patrick's mother, a nurse at South Shore, contacted the perinatal behavioral health program on November 20th seeking additional help for Lindsay. Nurse practitioner Julie Paul reached out to Lindsay. Okay. Lindsay reported she was very frustrated and scared, extreme insomnia, averaging only 3 hours per night and having racing thoughts. Right. Nurse Paul prescribed Prozac on November 21st, and I'm curious as to whether or not Nurse Paul saw her in person. If medications are not working for someone in this short succession in this period of time, she's now in a very short period of time run through 4 different medications and they're giving her a 5th. I want to know, was she seen in person by this nurse practitioner? If not, I think that's extremely irresponsible. That is just my opinion. Oh, hey, Omar, what's up? Hey, great questions, Lauren. We've been wondering that for a week. Wondering what? I didn't know what you were talking about at the time. Sorry. They did give her Ambien. Yeah, I know what I mean. I know what you mean, but I'm talking about these ER doctors because I know that she was prescribed Ambien, but we're getting there. We're not there yet. But like these ER doctors, my only concession there was at least they didn't pump her full of Ambien. But yeah, that's rough. All right, Jennifer Vaughn, thank you for the 450 joules. Thank you very much. All right. Ambien has horrible side effects. I was prescribed Ambien once, and I was too scared to take it. I never took it. The bottle just sat in my house. I just threw it away. I was like, fuck this. I've heard too many horror stories. Like I said, guys, everybody has a right to decide what they will and won't put in their body. A doctor can give you all the information and their expertise, but you have to decide for yourself. Hey, man, I want to do this or I don't. So sometimes it's just better to, thoroughly look into that medication and think the side effects aren't worth it. I'll just try some melatonin or something. So, all right. Okay. After merely 4 days on Prozac, Lindsay reported the medication intensified her insomnia. Yikes. She immediately informed her providers and Prozac was discontinued. This was the second antidepressant that had caused activation and worsening insomnia, a critical red flag for bipolar disorder the providers failed to recognize. And I 100% agree with that. This is now a pattern. There's a lot in the medical history that is concerning here. What is going on? And I have to wonder again, did anybody see her in person? Also, what dose was she on at that point? And did they try to adjust the dose? Was there a reason they said we just need to stop this right now? How many, was this one of the medications that she took consistently over a longer period of time? Or was it one of the ones that she tried a couple times and was like, no. There's some missing info here. Right, I have questions. On November 25th, Nurse Paul prescribed 3 different medications. Ambien, Remeron. What the fuck are you doing? Okay. I'm not watching the trial in real time like you guys are, but I am watching it, and I've heard this stuff, right? But just seeing it laid out like this in succession, what are you doing? That's insane. That's insane. Yeah, she may not have been on the medications that she was on for very long, but if you're on all those different medications and they're causing negative side effects, what you definitely don't need to do at that point is prescribe 3 new medications at the same time, 2 of them controlled substances. Jesus. This is why I say I think some of her providers failed her and some of them did not. That is fucked up. On November 26th, after taking Remeron, Lindsay experienced dissociation, perceiving the world around her as unreal, distorted, and distant. She was unable to determine what was real. She became disoriented, forgetful, confused, and disconnected from her own body. She was unable to drive and unable to be alone. She reported these alarming symptoms to her providers on November 28th, noting she was still struggling, sleeping only 3 to 4 hours and feeling disoriented and forgetful. On November 29th, Lindsay began treating with Nurse Gelada. I forgot how to say her name. NJ is what we're going to call her. Lindsay reported that she was anxious and frightened about what is happening and that she blamed herself. NJ correctly considered a bipolar presentation and prescribed Seroquel, an antipsychotic and mood stabilizer. Oh, okay. Seroquel. A lot of people don't like Seroquel. And I'll tell you what, a lot of people have really negative reactions to Seroquel. I had a doctor once prescribe me the lowest possible dose of Seroquel. And I cut it in half. And the next day, I was like, I didn't get any more sleep than I got the night before, but I felt like a fucking zombie the entire day. The entire day. It took so long to get that shit out of my system, and it was this tiny little dose. Tinier than you're supposed to take. And I know that, as I say for other people, my experience is not everyone's experience, but I'm just letting you guys know Seroquel is a very fucking powerful drug. And sometimes you have a really bad reaction to it. So, that it is messed up sometimes. And sometimes it's exactly what people need. It is exactly what some people need. But the thing is, there's a trial and error, and I feel that, in my opinion, based on this timeline, right, I need to read any sort of responses or rebuttals to this. Based on this timeline, they are rushing that trial and error process, and it's a mistake. So, all right. On November 29th, we did that. After starting Seroquel, her condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. She developed suicidal ideation and began experiencing what she described as intrusive thoughts, which were actually auditory hallucinations. The voice said, "I will not be the same. I want to die." Lindsay openly communicated her escalating internal turmoil to her husband, parents, and providers. She described her emotional state as emotionless and like a zombie, attributing this profound affective blunting to the Seroquel. On December 22nd, Lindsay reported to Nurse NJ, that she had lost 15 pounds, had no appetite, was experiencing panic attacks and confusion, and had a lack of attention over the past 4 days. That is 4 days. Yikes. On December 4th, Lindsay was so frightened by the hallucination, she called the New Bedford Suicide Hotline seeking help. She was told there was no emergency because she said she had no specific plan as to how she would kill herself. So, I know this is not going to be what a lot of people want to hear, but because of the dire and overwhelming need for inpatient mental health care by some people, even on a crisis short-term level, and the lack of beds and hospitals and facilities that can accommodate them legally, you have to have certain certifications and all that. You do have to turn people away sometimes. And if you go to see a counselor and they are overwhelmed, they have no beds, they have nothing that they can do to get you placed, and you say, I'm having suicidal thoughts, I've had them before, or I've been having them for a while, but I have no immediate desire to act on them, no, I don't have a plan, no, I don't want to die, they're not going to treat that like an emergency a lot of the time. Because they have to get to the people who are like, I want to do this right now. Or they're showing signs. They have some sort of indication of immediate danger. They have to turn those people away, and it sucks. And they say, you need to follow up with this person and this person. You need to do this and that. And a lot of times the patient doesn't do it. So it depends on the patient and how they follow up. But it is true. And I know a lot of people will try to tell you that this is not true. It is true that people get turned away for admission when they come in with suicidal ideation. They say, I want to hurt myself, or I'm thinking about killing myself. They do get turned away. And that's an awful thing to confront, but it is the truth. So, the criteria is unfortunately has to be strict because of the high demand and limited supply of beds. Let's put it that way. Lauren, when did they say the auditory hallucinations started? When did they say that? December 4th. She was frightened by hallucinations. Okay, when did they start though? Okay. Okay. I don't see it here. Yeah, I don't know. Oh, here. So sometime between November 29th and December 2nd, so over a period of 3 days. So then it wasn't just one hallucination on January 23rd. Correct. Right, correct. And the thing is, though, we have to read the doctor, the healthcare provider's response to this, if they have one, and see what they say about that. Did she report that, is the thing. So I noticed they say she developed these symptoms, right? She developed these symptoms. Okay. They say she openly communicated her escalating inner turmoil to her husband, parents, and providers. She described her emotional state as emotionless and like a zombie. Did she tell them specifically that she was hearing voices? That's important. And that's something that they will have to argue. So they've been talking about it for days. I know, but I'm just reading the civil case here. Right? This is a civil case, right? I'm not even diving into what's going on in the criminal trial right now. This, they're laying out here. She had these hallucinations. These were actually hallucinations. She communicated that she had escalating inner turmoil. I need to know if she explicitly expressed to them that she was having psychotic symptoms. That's important. So, because some people don't want to say that. Some people don't even want to tell their doctor that, right? They might tell them that I'm not doing very well. I'm feeling depressed. I even feel like I want to hurt myself. They might not want to admit, hey, I'm hearing some voices that aren't actually there. You know what I mean? So it's confusing. But I think I would agree that wasn't the first time it happened. However, I don't know if it was reported on that date. I can't recall that. So somebody says even the Reiners had a hard time getting their son into a mental hospital. A spot at a substance abuse center is easy peasy. Yeah. Right. Okay. Okay, so we've been through that. On December 15th, Patrick called NJ's office to report Lindsay has had a devastating week and that it was the worst day for Lindsay. She had horrible thoughts all day. Okay, so I noticed that this is what they put in quotes here, right? It was the worst day for Lindsay. She had horrible thoughts all day, but they don't put in quotes here. Lindsay had auditory hallucinations all day, every day. She felt debilitated, not interested in anything, exhausted, and could not get out of bed. The hallucinations were loud and continued all day, saying, I will never be the same. I will never be me again. You are damaged. You will never be the same. The only option is to die. I need to know if that was explicitly expressed to the nurse. And at that point, if so, why the fuck didn't the nurse call the police? If she is saying things like in this next paragraph, I have thoughts of harming the kids. She also told her mother about these thoughts because she was in a psychotic state. Lindsay also had paranoid delusions that people could hear her thoughts and that she would be locked in a hospital and have her children taken away, which is another reason why somebody might not report hallucinations to their provider. If they really believe that she's going to get locked up and her children taken away, that's the only outcome, then of course they're not going to report that, right? So, okay. One second. Somebody said or CPS. I know. You're supposed to, as a provider, as a mandatory reporter, you would have to tell DCF if a parent reported that to you. That's why I'm wondering, What exactly did she say to the providers? From what I remember from the testimony, and I could be wrong here because it's been a lot over the last, I don't even know how many days at this point, is I don't think she explicitly said to the provider that she was going to harm her children or she was thinking about harming her children. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong, please. But yeah. Okay. Lindsay's escalating suicidal thoughts prompted a visit to Mass Gen emergency room where she sought help. The ER suggested either admission to McLean or the partial hospitalization day program at Women and Infants Hospital in Rhode Island. So then they talk about this hospital, right? Their failure to properly treat her. And this is where I get frustrated with the hospital. This is one of those situations where I definitely feel like they let her down. I don't feel like they did the right thing, okay? On December 20th, she admitted herself to the PHP. Her chief complaint was, I feel numb and crazy depressed. Numb to all emotion. Can't feel love. Life is becoming a disaster. Couldn't feel fear. And she was messed up beyond repair. She had lost 15 pounds in a month. Okay, so in a month. I thought it was just over those few days. I was like, what the fuck? Had no motivation and reported that it takes all the effort in the world just to breathe. So that is still a concerning amount of weight loss. And of course, this decompensation is concerning. Lindsay's EPDS score was 23, indicating severe depression. Her generalized anxiety disorder 7 item was 21, higher than the threshold for the most severe category. I remember that one, right? Despite these severely elevated scores, Dr. Diaz, the attending psychiatrist at Women and Infants, concluded that Lindsay had no postpartum depression and rejected a bipolar disorder diagnosis because of no history of hypomania or psychosis or family history. Did they even talk to Patrick before they made that determination? Did they even talk to Patrick? The responsible thing to do is to reach out to the family and talk to them and then confront the patient with what the family member had to say. Hey, your husband told me this. Your husband told me you said this. You were experiencing this. You didn't tell me that. What's going on? I don't think they did that from what I can see here. This conclusion was negligent because Dr. Diaz failed to obtain an adequate history. Dr. Diaz's own notes documented that Lindsay's sister had experienced postpartum anxiety, a relevant family psychiatric history that should have been explored. Had Dr. Diaz a relevant family psychiatric... Okay, so had Dr. Diaz properly inquired about Lindsay's early postpartum period, she would have learned of the hypomanic episode that began immediately after delivery. Dr. Diaz also failed to recognize that Lindsay's providers had previously considered bipolar disorder as documented in Lindsay's record, stating she was started on Seroquel and concerned for bipolar. What the fuck? And I'm trying to reserve some judgment here because I haven't read the other side of the story. But this is bad. Okay. Dr. Diaz accepted Lindsay and Patrick's belief that her symptoms were due to overmedication and recommended weaning Seroquel. The clinical team at Women and Infants posited that Lindsay's symptoms were more pharmacologically induced than purely depressive. Okay, so these severe symptoms, whether they were pharmacologically induced or not, are an immediate issue. So how did they handle that? Dr. Diaz's assessment/plan documented that their facility is not a suitable treatment facility for Lindsay. Yet Dr. Diaz failed to recommend or arrange appropriate alternative treatment and instead discharged Lindsay after only 1 day of treatment with inadequate follow-up care. And so that's what I want to point out here is I think something I said earlier is if we ever came across a patient at the multiple psychiatric facilities I've worked at over the time that I've been working in psych, if we ever came across a patient that we could not provide adequate care to, but they're having severe symptoms and we had concerns, especially about over-medication or incorrect medication, that was more of a reason to make sure that person got hospitalized. If they're having an extreme adverse reaction to medications, and they've recently had a change, they need to be observed. You don't just wean off Seroquel for funsies at home. Jeez. The appropriate thing to do would have been for them to arrange, at least arrange for her to go with transportation and supervision to the emergency room to get checked out by doctors so they could tell her whether or not they needed to be hospitalized inpatient at their facility, where they could take care of her, where they could have provided proper care. And that is why I say some of these doctors did fail them. So, one sec here, guys. It's P. Mahone, thank you for the 1,000 joules. I appreciate that. And Vibe Flux World, thank you for the 10 joules. Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. All right, let's keep going. I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit. This is not a super long document. We're halfway through it, and I'm going to skim through some of it. So, all right. So they determined the day program was not appropriate. Nurse NJ. Okay, so Lindsay reached out to that nurse again, Nurse Jolata, to discuss her care. The nurse did not respond. Dr. Diaz's and the facility's negligent failure to properly evaluate Lindsay, obtain an adequate psychiatric history, and recognize the signs of bipolar disorder with postpartum onset resulted in a missed opportunity to provide appropriate treatment. Their recommendation to wean Seroquel without providing a proper alternative treatment plan or ensuring adequate follow-up care contributed to Lindsay's further deterioration. And they talk about McLean Hospital there and Dr. Goodhart's. Let's see. Following the Seroquel reduction, her suicidal ideation resurged. By December 29th, she told her husband, "I can't tough it out anymore. I need to go to McLean." On December 30th, she went to the emergency room, which suggested admission. Lindsay admitted herself to McLean Hospital, the nation's top-ranked psychiatric hospital. I don't know about that. We'll see. Due to her severe depression and suicidal ideation. Her admitting symptoms included passive suicidal ideation, feeling detached, hopelessness, depression, no appetite or energy. And these are just a list of her symptoms, right? Her insight and judgment were documented as limited. McLean placed Lindsay on a locked unit with 15-minute suicide checks. So that's standard for any patient on an inpatient unit. Some people are so severe they have to have a one-to-one. Most patients are done with a 15-minute check. So sometimes I had to fill in for somebody on the unit if they didn't have enough nurses. And so I would go out there and I would help them do checks. And so every 15 minutes I had to walk by everybody's rooms and be like, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just need to check and make sure you're okay." I didn't always say that. If I could just see them drawing or something in their room, I wouldn't bother them. But a lot of times I did have to go in the room and just be like, "Hey, what's going on?" And I also remember the one time I was a patient, how annoying it was when I was trying to sleep and some dude that I barely knew because I met him because he was my nurse kept coming by to watch me every 15 minutes. Like, that shit sucks. All right. But that is a standard patient care. Okay. That is standard patient care. Every 15-minute checks. Right. Okay. But they say here, however, the care she received was grossly inadequate. She was admitted on New Year's Eve and there was a skeleton crew because of the holiday. And that happens a lot. Patients spend their evening doing puzzles and coloring. Standard. Nurses stayed behind a desk and glass. Yep. Lindsay did not see a doctor until January 3rd, 3 days after admission. And if you are an inpatient and you get admitted on a Friday afternoon or Friday night, there's a very good chance you don't see a doctor until Monday. It depends on the facility that you're at, but sometimes you only see a nurse practitioner, and sometimes you only see the nurses. You don't always see a psychiatrist right away. You'll see a provider, but you may not see the psychiatrist. You may not see an MD. So. Let's see. Viplex World. Thank you again for 30 joules. Awesome. Dude, you're spoiling me. Thank you for the 2 joules. I appreciate that. All right. Let's see. Sorry, one second. Let me answer this. All right. All right. McLean placed Lindsay on a locked unit with 15 minutes, scheduled suicide checks, blah, blah, blah. The evening doing puzzle and coloring. She did not see a doctor until 3 days after admission. On January 3rd, the doctor advised her to stop Seroquel and benzos and prescribed trazodone for sleep. Well, we're going back to trazodone. Okay. On January 4th, she asked if she could go home for Cora's birthday because her thoughts had improved since the Seroquel decrease. She was approved for discharge. So she had been there for a few days. She was observed. If they noted her condition, were observing her every 15 minutes and there were no issues. And she said, I would like to leave. And it had been at least 3 days at that point. They're usually going to let the patient leave. Unless she's in an active psychosis or actively threatening to harm herself with a legitimate threat, a credible threat. At that point, there's no reason to really keep them. And at some point, if you decide to keep them longer than the 72 hours, at some point you have to petition the court for that. And it takes a long time. And then you don't do that for most patients. They have to be a severe case. And if somebody's improving after the 3 days, you think they've done their observation, they're okay, we can send them home. Also asking if she could go home for the birthday party it indicates insight into the future or a desire to do something in the future, which is a positive sign for somebody who has expressed suicidal ideation, right? So that makes sense to me, I guess, even though it didn't turn out well, right? Lindsay was discharged from McLean after a 5-day stay. So they say after only a 5-day stay here. I will tell you right now, most people do not get 5 days. Most people get kicked out after 2 or 3. Did you see the question from Miss Liz about what's passive SI? I did not. So sorry about that. Oh, here it is. What is passive SI? So passive is like, I'm thinking about dying. I want to die. I don't want to do this anymore. That kind of thing. It's thoughts of not wanting to be alive anymore, but it's not necessarily like I want to do this to myself. I keep thinking about this is what I want to do. This is how I'm going to do it. That's active, right? That's active. Passive is more like it's more like a general feeling of wanting to pass on, shall we say, right? So I have to be a little careful because of the YouTube filters, but I use the real words all the time anyway. Wanting to off yourself. There's no immediate threat that you are going to do something specific. That's the best way I can explain it. So, okay. Dr. Goodhart authored and signed the physician discharge summary, approving Lindsay's release despite her documented limited insight, judgment, and suicidal ideations. So, they say here her thoughts had improved since the decrease. She was there for 5 days. 5 days is longer than most people get. And then they say here she was released despite her limited insight, judgment, and suicidal ideations. But these people are checking on her every 15 minutes for 5 days. For 5 days. So at that point, there is a point where you cannot keep somebody if they don't want to be there. If they're like, I want to go. Let me go. This is what I want to do. You let them go. Because you have to have a very, very good reason to keep them beyond 72 hours against their will. We typically don't, let's put it this way, taking someone's rights and freedoms away involuntarily is awful. It's not something that anyone wants to do. So when you have a patient that you absolutely have to do that to, and you can tell they're in pain, you can tell they don't understand why they have to do this, and they don't want to do this, and you have to. It's an awful, terrible thing. They are trapped. Oftentimes in a room that is, at best, no, not even the size of a dorm room. And that's their life. They're in that room, right? And then they come out into the common room. They can do their group therapy. They can color. They can do puzzles. But that's it. Day in, day out. Somebody checking on you every 15 minutes. No privacy. No, no phones. No computers in most places, right? There might be some exceptions nowadays, especially in private facilities. But for the most part, no phones, no computers, unless you want to take a phone call on a landline in front of everybody else. You don't do that to somebody against their will unless you have to. So I will say that for the providers, And I will say again, even though I've had a very strong reaction to some of the things that have been alleged here, as far as I don't think they handled this the right way, I think that the providers in this situation, they did what they were supposed to do for somebody who is showing improvement over 5 days. That is what you're supposed to do. So if you keep somebody on a unit against their will like that, or if you keep them on the unit for longer than that, they would be profoundly psychotic or a danger to society. And if you check on them every 15 minutes and they're not that, you don't try to take their liberties away. It's cruel. And most of the time, it is not necessary. So, all right, one sec. Okay. All right, she was discharged after the 5-day stay. Dr. Goodhart signed the discharge summary. Let's see. She was returned to the care of the same outpatient providers who had been providing allegedly substandard care. Now, so with that, they usually give you resources, like a list of providers that you can see or talk to. So if you're really dissatisfied with your outpatient provider, you do have to go find somebody that you're comfortable with. You have to take that step. You have to initiate that. Returning her to the care of the same outpatient providers that she didn't like or thought were providing substandard care, the people who are dealing with emergent, deadly ill patients all day, they can't monitor what doctor everybody's seeing outpatient. They can't do that. They can make sure you have care, you have somewhere to go, and that if you don't, you have the resources so that you can do that. But if you are at the point where you can be discharged, where you're within your right mind, you're not actively thinking of hurting yourself at the time, it is then your responsibility, which a lot of people don't like hearing that, it is your responsibility to arrange your outpatient care. So that I would not fault them for, sending her to an outpatient provider she didn't like or she didn't like the standard of care. That's not their fault, because it's not their job to take care of you outside of the hospital. They do everything they can for you while you're there. That's it. And then they have people dedicated to making sure you have resources upon discharge. And a lot of people are horrified to learn that a lot of times that's just a fucking pamphlet with a list of providers and resources. You're kind of on your own. You kind of are. All right. After discharge, Dr. Goodhart from McLean called Lindsay and spoke for only 10 minutes, offering names of antidepressants. The staff at McLean suggested amitriptyline, yet another antidepressant. Why? The very class of medications that have repeatedly caused Lindsay to have adverse reactions. And I don't know why. That's my initial reaction is why, right? But I don't know why. I need to read their notes. I need to read their response. So I'll say this. The doctor calling to follow up after discharge, an inpatient doctor, that is rare. That is not the norm. That is above the standard of care. They say spoke for only 10 minutes, but that is absolutely above and beyond as far as what most people get. The overwhelming majority of people do not get that from their inpatient doctors, right? Sometimes they don't even see the same inpatient doctor on consecutive days. Or sometimes they only see the doctor once and they never hear from them again. That is actually... And I know it doesn't sound like much to a lot of people, but that is actually going beyond the norm. And it shouldn't be that way, right? You should be able to talk to somebody consistently, but that's not reality, given the demand for care and the way that these people are overworked and understaffed. All right. When Lindsay was discharged from McLean, she thought, I was just in the best hospital in the country, so there was not much hope. What? She decided she must appear like she was okay and had to do her best. Okay. Dr. Goodhart's and McLean's hospital's negligent failure. Okay. To properly evaluate Lindsay, obtain an adequate psych history, and this is kind of the same thing they said before, right? The documented limited insight, blah, blah, blah. So I don't agree with that. I disagree with this one. I do not think that hospital and that doctor were negligent based on what I've seen. I think the recommendations for other antidepressants, I don't know why the decision was to like recommend other antidepressants. However, it sounds like they were suggesting things that she would then have to take up with her outpatient provider and say, what about this medication? Is this going to work? What about this? Should I try this? You know, like it doesn't sound like they actually prescribed it to her. Otherwise, they would have said they did that, right? Maybe some other provider did. Or if they did, I don't know, man. But I don't think that they're giving her 5 days on the unit and paying very close, watchful attention to her for 5 days was negligent. I do not. I don't think they're discharging her if she wasn't showing immediate signs of credible threat to harm herself or others at that time. After the 72 hours was up, the first 72 hours is up, and even beyond that, I don't think that's negligent. I disagree. So, one sec. Oh my god, how long have I been talking? How long have I been talking? Oh my gosh, I just didn't Omar. I am so sorry. 11:09, 11. I was getting in 3 minutes. Sorry, dude. I'm looking at you guys' chats. You know what's really funny is I just said some really personal stuff, making fun of myself, and now you'll never know what I said. I'm so sorry about that. P. Mahone, thank you for being a member for 17 months. He says you're muted. Yes, I know. Thank you for the $2. I feel like I owe you $2 now. You forgot to unmute. SMH6617, thank you for $2. We all went deaf. Turn your mic up. I had my mic turned off. I'm so sorry. I don't know where I left off. Like where I was muted is the problem. So hopefully you guys heard me read this paragraph. If not, it says her hallucinations continued after the January 16th debilitating depression. You're trying to children, kill yourself. You'll never be the same. They gave her the amitriptyline. It says on January 20th, because she was having such awful thoughts and was so numb, she researched what is a psychopath. And that's when I went off on a tangent for at least a minute and a half of the 3 minutes I was muted, saying how I sometimes in the middle of the night, if I can't sleep at 3 a.m, Google who did 9/11. Why would someone do 9/11? It doesn't mean I'm interested in doing 9/11. You know what I mean? And I was talking about, while you guys were not listening to me, and I was just sitting here talking to myself about how I watched a TV show where a character was bipolar, and I started Googling obsessively for a period of time. Am I bipolar? Am I a psychopath? Am I? But it was in a lot more detail than that, and I'm not going to repeat it, because when I said it out loud, I knew it was weird the first time, and so now I'm not going to repeat it. Sorry, bro. But I've researched some weird ass shit when I thought something was wrong with me. You know, this is kind of like looking at WebMD, right? I'm being like, am I depressed? And it returns, you have brain cancer. Like, that's fucking stupid. Oh my god! So this is, oh my god, that's what you were saying. Yeah, no, I was saying how I literally, like, a few weeks ago, I remember I like couldn't sleep in the middle of the night. I went down a rabbit hole. I'm googling like, why do people do shit like bombing, right? So I started googling. I was like, most deadly bombings in the universe, and then I just started reading that for like hours. So like, people when they are in a spiral or even just bored, if you're just bored, you might be like, I wonder if I'm a fucking psychopath. You know what I mean? Sometimes there's no rhyme or reason to these things. So saying that doesn't really prove anything. That doesn't prove that she was in her right mind or not when she murdered her children. That doesn't mean anything to me. So he says, Lord on HSA, watch them. I swear to God, it was just research. Like, you went mute when you took a sip of your blue mug and never unmuted. That can mean anything at this point. I do that all the time. All right. Anyways, I'm going to move on from the tangent I went on that only is known to me at this point. So, okay. On January 23rd, during another 17-minute appointment, Lindsay reported being a little more anxious with her heart racing and more morning anxiety. Recorded her mood is the same, flash, less anxious. She had no motivation, numb, has to force herself up out of the house. Her sleep and medication efficacy were poor, insight was poor, and her psychiatric condition generally was unchanged. So she increases her dose of the antidepressant. That night, Lindsay didn't sleep. So in fairness, what they're describing here does sound like it could be an episode of major depressive disorder. However, I feel like we're totally ignoring the cycles, right? That's being described in this document. But I've only heard one side of the story in this civil case, right? I haven't read their side of it. So we'll see. Am I muted? I just want to double check. If we were all judged by our internet searches, oh boy, says Ariane Fowler. Again, I'm sorry, but my internet searches are like, are Labubu's satanic? Like, does that mean Does that mean I'm part of a cult or something? Like, dude, we all Google stuff when we're like concerned, right? And WebMD or whoever will tell you that you're dying, but it's not necessarily an indication of our condition. Like, however long later, it's just not even a day later, even an hour later. So, all right. Somebody says yes, they are. I personally, I don't want one, so that's fine. Okay. And this is where it gets to the point where she's describing what happened here. And remember, this is her lawsuit, her court filing. January 4th, 2023. Lindsay woke severely depressed with suicidal thoughts. She gave the children breakfast. She took Cora to the pediatrician because Cora complained of stomachache. Later, she went to the backyard with the children, built a snowman, and sent a picture to Patrick and her mother. Okay. The suicidal hallucinations continued all day nonstop. Later in the afternoon, the voice began saying, "You should harm the children." Lindsay thought about dinner and realized she had not prepared anything. She asked Patrick about takeout. She looked at the map to see how long it would take because she did not want to be alone and needed help. So this is like, again, this is why there's a difference between this and the criminal trial, because here they're saying she did not want to be alone and needed help, right? The prosecution in the criminal trial is trying to establish that this was premeditated, that she knew what she was doing, that she intentionally killed her children with the full capability to stop herself if she wanted to. But this civil case, she's explaining, I didn't want to be alone and I needed help. And I don't know that the response is necessarily going to say, you're a liar, right? Because they don't know. They weren't there. And at that point, it's not their job, the psychiatrist's job, to speculate on what her condition was when they were not speaking to her or aware of her condition at that point in time. I don't know. As soon as Patrick left to pick up the food, there was a loud, demanding, repetitious voice. "This is your last chance. Kill the children so you can kill yourself. This is your last chance. You have to kill the kids so you can kill yourself." Lindsay felt a force come over her. And I will say right now, like, a question that will probably be asked here is, later in the afternoon, the voice began saying this. The suicidal hallucinations continued all day nonstop. Why, aware that you were having hallucinations earlier in the day, didn't you go to the hospital? It's something that will probably be disputed. And she could say, yes, I had the kids. Yes, I was taking care of the kids. But if you're in a state of emergency like that, they'll probably argue that she should have called 911. So, all right. Lindsay experienced command auditory hallucinations. A demanding, powerful male voice explicitly ordered her. She felt an overwhelming, irresistible compulsion to comply, entering a dissociative dreamlike state where her physical actions felt utterly disconnected from her conscious volition. She perceived her body was just acting, and she was merely watching herself do it. She reported she had no choice but to follow these compelling directives. So, when people are in a state of psychosis, they're hearing command hallucinations. There are times when people can separate that from themselves. They can understand, like, I'm responding to internal stimuli. I'm responding to something that is not reality. I know this is wrong and I'm scared. I need to do something about this. There are other times where it is so overwhelming and strong that you completely lose your instincts as to what you should be doing. All of a sudden, what you're perceiving becomes your reality. And I'm just going off of what patients have described and what I've observed in practice, right? Because I've seen some awful, awful things when people were in psychotic episodes. It's like it's uncontrollable. I've never experienced that myself, right? I've had my own problems, right? But I've never experienced an episode like that. I hope that never happens, right? But I have seen some very dedicated patients who are consistent with their care, who do everything they're supposed to do, whose family do everything they're supposed to do for them, come back into the hospital in the worst state I've ever seen them. Because sometimes taking all the right steps, doing everything that you're told to do, it doesn't fix it. And I think people, I think people, when you don't spend a lot of time around these populations, people have a hard time believing that. And if you never stood by somebody in their most desperate hour, watching them just totally escape their rational instincts and thoughts and try to answer questions, try to talk about what's going on and fail because they're so confused. They're so convinced that something else is going on. If you've never experienced that, if you've never been around that, I can understand why it seems unrealistic because it sounds ridiculous, but it is real. It does happen. And I'm not saying that that was 100% with certainty what happened to her. I am open to the arguments that some of this was preventable, but I'm not writing that off. I'm not going to say she definitely knew what she was doing and had every opportunity to stop herself, and she totally could have. I'm not going to say that with certainty. And I think so many people are set based on emotions and the tragedy of this case where 3 innocent children died, were murdered by their mother of all people, feel like they have to have these extremely strong convictions and opinions where nothing that anybody says could change their mind. There is so much vitriol about people's opinions because of the tragic nature of this case that people forget that we don't really know what happened there and that multiple things are possible. And so the trust has to be put in those jury members to listen to everything from both sides and to make an informed decision. And those jury members have heard things that we will never hear, probably never hear, right? They've seen things that we will probably never see, like the 911 call, right? And it's up to them. But I just want to remind people, it is 100% okay to not feel strongly one way or the other. It is okay to be on the fence. It is okay to not agree with a lot of the things that the loudest people on the internet are saying. It is okay to withhold some judgment, right? Because even if you've been watching this stream for however long I've been doing it, you can even see I'm all over the place with, well, she did this, well, they did that. Well, I don't know, because there's multiple possibilities here, because this is a complicated situation and I'm only reading one side of the story. So it is a devastating, terrible case for everyone involved, for everybody who's been grieving and suffering for the past 3 years to now be subjected to these cameras, to the internet, to see Patrick and Lindsay, their parents, their siblings, their loved ones, seeing them all go through this, having to listen to this, and having to see the awful vitriolic things that people are saying online. It is tragic. Nothing short of that. And there are a lot more people than just Lindsay and Patrick who are suffering from this. So I just wish people would be a little more careful. I might see something and think, oh my God, why would these doctors do that? But then I stop and I think, hey, hold on. Let me look at the other side for a second, So I just want to be careful with that. Okay. We're getting closer to the end here, guys. Don't worry. Lindsay described, I lost all control. My body started acting without any control on my parts. I was just following commands, all action. This voice demanded action. And remember, this is Lindsay's document that we're reading, submitted to a court. You don't just submit willy-nilly things to a court and be like, oh no, that didn't count. 3 years later, this is still her version of events. She has never denied this. It's extremely important to acknowledge that, even if this isn't going to be brought up in the criminal case, right? Lindsay described, I lost all control. My body started acting without any control on my part. I was just following commands, all action. This voice demanded action. And it says here, Lindsay described. So people who keep saying, Lindsay never confessed. Lindsay was coerced. Patrick told her that. That's the only reason she remembered. No, Lindsay, every single time Lindsay talked about this is not going to be documented on the internet. Have you heard every conversation she had with her psychiatrist? Have you heard every conversation she had with the police who absolutely questioned her after this happened? No. It's ridiculous. Lindsay described she lost her control, right? And this is tough to read, okay? This is not an easy thing to read, but this is her version of events, okay? Lindsay proceeded to strangle each of her children, uttering, "Go to God, baby." Following these acts, she undertook a severe suicide attempt, ingesting a substantial quantity of various medications, self-inflicting lacerations to her wrists and neck, and jumping from a second-floor window approximately 20 feet to the ground below. Okay. One sec. Lindsay suffered catastrophic injuries, including a thoracic spinal cord injury resulting in permanent paralysis below the sternum. She also suffered multiple closed fractures of her cervical and thoracic vertebrae and multiple rib fractures. Cora and Dawson died on January 24th. Callan succumbed to his injuries and died on January 27th. Lindsay consistently maintains her actions were compelled by a hallucinatory voice, not a conscious decision, and expresses profound, enduring love for her children. Okay. This is her account of what happened. This is her representation of what happened. Nobody, not Lindsay, not Lindsay's attorney, not Lindsay's family, not Lindsay's friends, nobody is contesting that. Nobody has come out and said, I don't think she did it. I don't think she's telling the truth. So respect. I think that we should respect and honor what's happening here to those children, what happened to those children by taking this seriously and by giving considerable thought to whether or not she was in a state where she was capable of stopping herself from doing this. And I think that anything that's a distraction from that, for entertainment, for speculation, it's not appropriate. That's how I feel about it. And I know that other people feel differently, and you're allowed to feel that way, and I won't fight you, but I feel that it's inappropriate to distract from this horrible thing that happened by filling in the gaps of things that we don't know or understand with assumptions and theories about how she must not have done it. I think it's disrespectful. It's disrespectful to everyone involved, to the children who died, to the husband who lost his children because his wife killed them, to the woman who was apparently failed by the medical system, and to every woman after this who may potentially go through something similar. To have people write it off and say, nah, she didn't do that. That's not what happened. That's not what happens. That doesn't make sense. This doesn't add up. It's not possible. It's not true. That's not true. I don't believe that. Neither does Lindsay, neither does Patrick, neither does the attorneys on either side of this case, neither does anybody who knows these people who are involved in this. So somebody on a computer or a cell phone trying to fill in the gaps of what they don't understand or what they think is weird, or thinking that somebody's eyes are creepy, is disrespectful, inappropriate, and not something I'm going to give any weight to. That's my opinion. And I don't mean to offend people with that. I don't mean to attack. That's not an attack on people. I'm just saying how I feel. And if people really don't like that and can't handle that, it's okay to not listen. Because if some people disagree with me and they continue to be disrespectful, to everyone involved in this, then I probably just won't listen to their opinions, right? And that's okay. It's okay sometimes to take a step back and say, hey, on this one, maybe I don't need to be involved with this person's opinion, or maybe I don't need to fight this person. Maybe I just need to respect everybody's right to feel the way that they feel as an observer, and just kind of stay in my own space. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to stay in my own space. That way, if somebody doesn't want to hear what I have to say, if they don't agree with what I have to say, they just, just close the browser. Go to a different page. That's all. I'm not trying to hurt anybody. I'm just trying to be honest. So, all right. We're almost done here, guys. Don't worry. I know that got tricky. That got hard. Okay. Expert psychiatric opinions. And I don't know if I want to go through all this in detail tonight. I don't think it's too much, but they'd say that this doctor, Dr. Spinelli, met with Lindsay at the psych hospital on June 11th, spoke with her by telephone, also interviewed Patrick, Lindsay's sister, Lindsay's mother, and Lindsay's mother-in-law. Again, this is what I'm saying. Like, all these people have been involved in the investigation, in the conversations with healthcare providers. All of these people were involved, and they don't dispute what happened. It's fucked up to pretend that that's not what happened. All right. Dr. Spinelli diagnosed Lindsay with bipolar 1, severe with psychosis, and anxious distress in postpartum onset. She concluded Lindsay had a baseline bipolar disorder with minimal symptoms after her second childbirth, and that her symptoms worsened after her third birth when she was prescribed an antidepressant. And I got to go back to that second childbirth when we read earlier that she expressed symptoms to her doctor, her provider. They tried to prescribe antidepressants. She said, no, I don't want that. And the symptoms went away with diet and exercise and a little bit of time. And I think, did she consistently follow up after that? Did she keep talking to providers? Did she see a therapist? And they're going to ask these questions, right? And they're going to ask whether or not these providers should have reasonably thought that she had actual bipolar disorder patterns, not just a single episode of sleeplessness and odd behavior after childbirth. They're going to try to establish that it's not their fault, that they couldn't have seen the pattern because she did or didn't report things. There's going to be a lot of arguments there. So, unless they settle the case, in which case there won't be. So, okay. Dr. Spinelli noted an antidepressant medication can create manic or hypomanic symptoms and mood instability in one who has bipolar illness. This is a well-known response for a person with underlying bipolar disorder. Okay. Dr. Spinelli opined that the providers never seemed to communicate with one another. That's definitely true. That no one ever asked her to describe the content of her intrusive thoughts, which were in fact hallucinations, and that Lindsay was repeatedly given antidepressants instead of a mood stabilizer. So they'll argue this about what she described, whether it was intrusive thoughts versus hallucinations. That's something that the doctors are going to have to argue. Because sometimes intrusive thoughts, even though they're intrusive, you feel like you can't get rid of it, you keep thinking about it, it's not a hallucination, right? There's a difference. And so they're going to have to argue about which one it was and why she is now saying it was hallucinations versus these doctors who are saying it wasn't. Or didn't clock that, rather. Okay, Dr. Spinelli specifically commented on the failures of multiple providers regarding the initial Zoloft reaction. She noted that if practitioners had recognized the hypomanic activation after Zoloft, a second or third antidepressant would not have been tried. I mean, I think that sounds reasonable. But I don't understand the thought process as to what they did there. Regarding women and infants, she noted that Dr. Diaz did not review mood symptoms of last pregnancy and this postpartum period and did not review hypomanic episode immediately after delivery, which was the beginning of her postpartum psychosis. This facility that just sent her away, it's like, no, you just need to taper off this med. Get out. We can't help you here. I think they're the ones that are most at risk here. I don't think they did the best they could have for her when they discharged her or said, we can't help you here. I think I don't know what their policy is, but I don't think that they did the right thing. So, Dr. Spinelli concluded she did all that she could to obtain the appropriate treatment. Dr. Paul Zeisel, as forensic psychologist, also conducted extensive clinical interviews with Lindsay and her parents. Okay, he was the initial forensic expert to engage Lindsay in the immediate aftermath of the incident. Dr. Zeisel concurred with the assessments of Spinelli and Resnick. He opined to a reasonable degree of certainty that Ms. Clancy's clinical course was significantly complicated by polypharmacy and the involvement of multiple prescribers. So multiple meds over a short period of time, multiple doctors, which obscured an accurate diagnosis and appropriate intervention and treatment. So reading that, I think that's true. However, they're going to ask why she didn't take meds as prescribed, because we know that she sometimes didn't, right? Why she didn't take meds as prescribed every time, and why she continued to go seeing multiple providers. They're going to say, like, basically, why were you doctor shopping? Because these are things they have to confront. So, furthermore, the psychotropic medications she received appear to have paradoxically exacerbated her underlying psychiatric vulnerability, precipitating a state of manic psychosis characterized by compelling command hallucinations. Okay. All right. Ashley says, sadly, it's been proven that Lindsay also had not disclosed all the correct info and didn't tell the truth with other providers and to her husband. Sorry, but coming from the other side of this. So I don't know if you're talking to me or someone in the chat, but I don't have a side. So the thing is, like, even going through this, the reason I've been doing this for 2 hours is because I'm sitting here thinking both sides have a point. So I don't have a side. So don't be afraid to, like, say that. You know what I mean? I'm just saying, don't worry about it. Like, you can express yourself as long as you're not being a dick, right? Like, don't be a dick. If you're like, Lauren, you're a stupid bitch, she's a liar, like, then I might have a problem, right? But what you just said is not offensive at all. So you're good. Don't worry about it, man. All right, let's keep going. Okay. Dr. Zeisel noted that Lindsay's parents conveyed profound shock and devastation at the depth of her psychological decompensation, indicating a prior lack of complete comprehension regarding the actual severity of her underlying illness. So that, it kind of sounds like she wasn't telling them everything. I don't know if they told Patrick more or less, or if she told Patrick more or less than she told her parents. So I don't know there, but it sounds like they were kind of in the dark on a lot of stuff. And I know that he had called them at one point, according to what he said in the past, that he called them and they came up after she expressed thoughts of, like, intrusive thoughts. So they were helping them from out of state at one point. They came up from out of state. So this underscores how the medical providers failed to adequately communicate the severity of Lindsay's condition or take appropriate action. So I don't know about that. How the medical providers failed to communicate the severity. If you are an adult entering treatment and you want to withhold information from people, you don't want to tell everyone everything you talk to your psychiatrist about, they can't make you do that. Unless she signed a release saying you may tell these specific friends or family members or whoever this specific information, you may disclose this information. If it falls outside of that, they can't communicate that to the family. Not unless she's in an active emergency state where her life is being threatened, like she's so psychotic and that she needs an emergency treatment order for some sort of injection, for example, and they need to ask the parents or somebody if she has any medication allergies or something like that. That's a situation where you might be able to break that. But otherwise, the providers can't communicate anything about her condition that she doesn't explicitly tell them and probably put in writing that they can communicate. Even if she says, you can communicate with my husband, if she says, you can communicate this to my husband and doesn't give them explicit permission to communicate something else, they can't do that. So it's very, you have to be very careful with privacy stuff. Okay. Okay. The standard of care required defendants to obtain a complete psychiatric history, including detailed inquiry into Lindsay's mood and symptoms during and after her prior pregnancies. Had any of the providers done so, they would have learned of the hypomanic episodes that followed her second and third deliveries, which were critical indicators of bipolar disorder postpartum onset. The standard of care required defendants to recognize that Lindsay's severe adverse reaction to Zoloft, characterized by activation, worsening insomnia, and racing thoughts, was a red flag for bipolar disorder. The standard of care further required that after a second antidepressant, Prozac, caused similar activation, defendants should have diagnosed bipolar disorder and prescribed a mood stabilizer rather than continuing to try antidepressants. The standard of care required defendants to conduct appropriate testing, including blood plasma levels of medication, to determine why she was having adverse reactions to relatively low doses of medication and whether she was a slow metabolizer. And I mean, they're going to show, if they ever ordered labs or anything like that, they're obviously going to show that, but it sounds like they didn't. So the standard of care required defendants to follow the start low and go slow principle when prescribing meds, particularly given Lindsay's demonstrated sensitivity to psychotropic meds. Instead, they added and accelerated medications in an ad hoc manner that radically increased the risks to Lindsay. I agree with that. Now, acknowledging that the way they prescribed these medications just kind of threw them out at her was probably wrong is not in itself a 100% determination that she was or was not capable of conforming her conduct and stopping herself from killing her children. I just want to point that out. Two things can be true, right? Like, these doctors, they could have made mistakes. They could have done things that they probably shouldn't have done. But that also doesn't 100% determine that at the moment she murdered her children, she definitely could not have possibly stopped herself. So that's going to be important. They're going to have to argue about that, right? The standard of care required defendants to inquire into the content of Lindsay's intrusive thoughts, which were actually auditory hallucinations. So I'm reading that here a few times now. They say which were actually auditory hallucinations, and I want to know where that comes from. I want to know who determined they were actually auditory hallucinations. Was it one of these specialists who interviewed her after the fact? Or did these doctors themselves write that in their notes? Because if they did and they didn't do anything about it, that's pretty bad. Had they done so, they would have recognized the psychotic nature of her symptoms and the danger she posed to herself and her children, including the danger of postpartum psychosis. The standard of care required defendants to coordinate care among themselves and with other treating providers. I just had to check to make sure I wasn't muted again. Sorry. Okay. Let's see. Instead, the providers failed to communicate with one another, and NJ did not even return women and infants' call to discuss Lindsay's care. The standard of care required defendants to seek collateral information from Lindsay's family members who could have provided crucial information about the severity of her condition and her functioning at home. So, I will say again, they can only do that with a release. They can't just do that for funsies and call up and be like, hey, mama, I want to gossip about Lindsay's medical condition. Like, unless she signed a release that said, you can call my family members and communicate with them, or you can answer their questions if they call, they can't do that. So that's that's something I'm curious about. Like, did she sign releases? What boxes did she check for what information they could communicate to them? And did she explicitly ask them not to communicate anything? So that's important. The standard of care required defendants to recognize that Lindsay, as a patient suffering from severe postpartum mental health disorders with suicidal ideation, posed a risk of harming not only herself, but also her children. Okay. The standard of care required Dr. Goodhart and McLean Hospital to provide adequate inpatient care, properly evaluate her, and ensure appropriate discharge planning rather than discharging her after 5 days with limited insight, judgment, and suicidal ideations back to the same providers who had been providing inadequate care. So this here, again, I disagree with this. I see no, base this only on this document, right? I don't think this document has established that she was discharged with limited insight, judgment, and suicidal ideations. A lot of times people who come in with those symptoms are discharged after 48 hours. Sometimes they don't even get the 72. She had 5 days where they were checking on her every 15 minutes for 5 days. She asked to be discharged. They didn't see an immediate emergent reason that they could keep her against her will. So she was discharged. You can't just snap your fingers and decide, nah, I don't want you to go home. After and I can't speak to every state, right? But in this state where I work, at least, after the 72-hour period is up, you are then considered a voluntary patient. You sign a form saying you are voluntary, you're staying voluntarily beyond that. And if you decide you want to be discharged, you have a right to talk to your doctor and request that you be discharged. And if they don't have an immediate, severe reason, like that you are in active psychosis or immediately threatening harm, to keep you and petition the courts to keep you longer, they have to let you go. So when it comes to McLean Hospital, I totally disagree with their characterization of things. That's just my opinion. When it comes to some of these other providers, when it comes to the women and infants facility, I think they made some mistakes. That was not good, right? So that's just my opinion. I think there's it's not a sweeping answer to the question of whether or not her doctors failed her. I think it depends on who you're talking about and when and why they did what they did. So tell Lauren to stop being gay and stream with me. Well, can I do both? Can you send me a link? Just email it to me and I'll join you after this. I'll be done soon. I'm around 24 or 29. I'm going to skim. So just email me the link, dude. All right. The standard of care required Doc Diaz and women and infants to properly evaluate her, obtain adequate psych history, okay, including the early postpartum period. So imagine going to get care at women and infants and they don't get adequate history to your previous postpartum symptoms. Like that makes me want to facepalm. But I won't do that because my face is already red. I don't need to hit it. I had caffeine. So I'm glowing. Okay. All right. Defendants knew or should have known that Lindsay presented a real, clear, and present danger of harm to herself and her young children. Defendants collect. So again, that depends on like who you ask. If somebody has previously had suicidal thoughts or even had suicidal thoughts when you last saw them, like you can't just commit them or take action without a court order, a law enforcement order, or an order from a therapist, a doctor, or a psychiatrist who has in person probably laid eyes upon her, or over telehealth unless they made an explicit threat. Like you can't just act upon previous symptoms and previous risk. You have to act upon what's happening right then. We reserve involuntary admissions for people who are in an immediate state of crisis. If people involuntarily admitted or immediately admitted everyone who expressed any sort of intrusive thought or everyone who expressed any sort of suicidal thought, even passive suicidal thought, the hospitals would be overflowing. I mean, when I worked in one of the busiest hospitals downtown, there were some times when I had like 5 or 6 Baker Act patients waiting in the emergency room for like the entire weekend because none of the area facilities had any beds available. The patients, some of them became frustrated and said, look, I was just trying to find a place to stay. I want to go home. And I was like, dude, until the doctor clears you, until the doctor signs off that you can go, you can't go anywhere legally. You cannot. So, you know, it's bad to keep people when you shouldn't, right? Because you're taking away people's liberties and forcing them to sit in a crowded ER where people who are experiencing psychosis and violent outbursts and drug-addled crazy behavior, and it's dangerous and scary and terrifying, and you get no privacy because somebody's watching you the entire time you're there, a stranger. Most of the time you're laying on a bed next to somebody else who's laying on a bed next to somebody else who's laying on a bed, and they all smell bad, right? And you're stuck in a little room with them. You don't want to do that to somebody unless you have to, right? So we don't just force people to stay somewhere or come grab them up from their homes because they have previously expressed a problem. If she expressed to one of them in the moment that she was having these thoughts, then they should have done something about it. So I think, again, this is going to come down to who did what and when, as to whether or not they were actually negligent. So, all right, hold on. All right. Defendants' collective failures to comply, more likely than not, directly and proximately caused the injuries suffered by Lindsay, including Lindsay's killing her children in an attempt to kill herself. Okay. Negligence / medical malpractice, personal injury is count 1. Let's see, count 2 is loss of parental consortium. Count 3, loss of spousal consortium. Count 4, vicarious liability. Okay. They're asking for a judgment in her favor, award her damages, including punitive damages as allowed by law. Okay, for the personal injuries suffered by Lindsay Clancy, including her physical injuries, psychological trauma, loss of consortium with her children and spouse, and all other damages permitted by law, plus interest as allowed by law from the date of this complaint, which was in January this year. Let's see. Plus attorneys, costs and attorney's fees. So, and any other such relief the court deems appropriate. So that's it, guys. That took me way longer than I meant for it to take. Sorry, but hopefully I did okay here. Aside from the 3 to 10 minutes that I was muted and making weird facial expressions, Omar is about to go live. I think I'll pop over there. And Omar, if you guys don't know, is an attorney out in California. He and I stream together a lot. Let me redirect you guys to him. I'll take a short little break here, and then I'll probably join him. Let's see, tilted. Did he even set it up yet? If he didn't, oh my God, he didn't. Oh my God. Okay, well, mods have put a link to Omar's channel in the chat. So go there. We'll be live soon. And I'll be talking to him for a little bit. So, all right, thanks guys for listening. I know that not everybody's going to agree with me on everything, but I appreciate you being respectful and taking the time. You guys have a good night. And I want to say again, thank you to Troublemaker Baker for becoming a new member. That's awesome. If you go to my YouTube channel and you click on the members tab, you should be able to see every members only content post or video I've ever made. And I'll be doing another one probably this weekend. So thanks everybody. Again, I appreciate it. And I know this is a tough topic, so thanks for sticking with me. I wouldn't blame anybody if they couldn't sit through 2 hours of that, but we're all done now. So I'm going to mute myself and go to bed and probably Google stuff about bombings. All right, bye. See you later. Oh, don't forget to like for me. It helps me out a lot. Okay, now bye.